I need to say something before I start. I've told this story 3 times now. Once to my commanding officer. Once to a medical assessment panel who wanted to know if I was psychologically stable after what happened. And once, very quietly, to my mother, over a comm link that kept cutting out because the relay towers near our home colony were still damaged from the secondary pulse wave. Each time people listened. They nodded. They said things like, "That must have been difficult," or "You're very brave for surviving that." And every single time, I had to stop myself from correcting them. Because surviving wasn't the impressive thing that happened in the Ver corridor. The impressive thing, the terrifying thing, was watching humans survive it first. Let me go back to the beginning. I am not a soldier. I want to make that clear from the start because it matters to how I saw everything that followed. I am an observer. That's my official designation, third-grade observer, which means I'm trained to watch, record, and analyze. I go into environments that other people have already secured, and I document what happened, what the landscape looks like, what the casualties are, and I file reports that go into databases that most people never read. I've done this job for 11 years. I've been to 34 different conflict zones across 9 star systems. I've seen destruction on a scale that would make most civilians stop sleeping at night. I thought I understood war. I thought I understood violence. I did not understand either one until the day the galactic sovereignty attacked the Ver corridor, and a human woman named Sergeant Delia Varros grabbed my arm and said, "Stay behind me and don't stop moving, no matter what you hear." The Ver corridor was a transit hub. If you've never been, picture a structure roughly the size of a small moon that isn't quite a moon. It's too manufactured for that. The exterior shell is composite alloy, layered in a way that makes it look almost organic from a distance, like the pale shell of something enormous that washed up on the edge of this particular solar system and decided to stay. 5 docking rings, each one capable of processing 47,000 vessels per standard rotation. Inside, it's less like a space station, and more like a city that forgot it wasn't supposed to have weather. There are levels, dozens of them, climate-controlled zones for species who need different atmospheric densities, markets that stretch for 2 kilometers in a single direction, transit tunnels carved through the interior like hollow veins, and at the center, deep in what the locals called the core, a power array that kept everything running. The lights, the atmosphere, the shields, the tram systems that moved hundreds of thousands of beings between levels every single hour. When I arrived at Ver corridor on the morning of cycle 4441, it was because I'd been assigned to document a routine infrastructure audit. The Confederacy had recently upgraded the eastern docking rings, and there was some question about whether the load-bearing modifications had been properly certified. Standard work. The kind of assignment that produces reports so boring they're used as sleep aids in some academic institutions. I arrived on a transport from Selenith 7, along with roughly 400 other travelers. The docking bay smelled like recycled air and something faintly sweet, some kind of food being sold from a cart near the bay entrance. There was a group of school-aged Malari children near the welcome terminals, all of them pushing each other and pointing at the overhead displays like they'd never seen transit maps before. It felt like every transit hub I'd ever walked through. I collected my credentials, located my contact in the infrastructure office, and spent the first 3 hours of my day reviewing technical diagrams in a room that had the kind of lighting that makes everything look slightly underwater. The humans were already there when I arrived. I noticed them but didn't think much of it. There were 4 of them, a security detail attached to a diplomatic envoy that had passed through the corridor 2 days earlier and was now in the process of extending its stay for reasons I didn't know. Humans in security roles aren't unusual in the corridor. The Confederacy has been integrating human military personnel into joint operations for about 30 years now, ever since the accession, and they've become a recognizable presence in high-traffic transit zones. Most species find them reassuring. They're physically large for bipeds, they tend to communicate clearly, and they have a reputation, sometimes exaggerated, often not, for staying calm when situations deteriorate. The four of them were stationed at different points on level 14. I passed two of them on my way to the infrastructure office. A tall one with close-cropped dark hair who was standing near the central corridor junction, arms loose at his sides, watching foot traffic with a kind of patient attention I recognized from other experienced security personnel. And a shorter one near the atmospheric regulation checkpoint. A woman I'd later learn was named Sergeant Varros, who was doing something I found a little odd at the time. She was watching the ceiling. Not the foot traffic, not the people moving through the checkpoint. The ceiling. Slowly and methodically, her eyes moving in a pattern that looked almost like she was reading something written up there. I noticed it for maybe 2 seconds, and then forgot about it. I should have paid more attention. The attack came at 14:37 hours, Meridian Standard. I know the exact time because I was looking at my recording unit when the first alert sounded. I was annotating a file, something about junction stress tolerances on the Eastern Ring modification, and the timestamp is right there in the metadata. 14:37:22. That's when the proximity alert went off. Now, proximity alerts in transit hubs aren't automatically cause for alarm. They trigger for a dozen reasons: sensor malfunctions, vessels drifting slightly out of their designated approach lanes, debris in the outer buffer zones. Most people who work in these environments develop a sort of automatic filter for them. Hear the alarm, check the secondary indicator lights, see that it's green, go back to what you were doing. The indicator lights did not turn green. They turned a color I had never seen used in an active alert system before. Not red, not amber. A pulsing, deep violet that my brain initially didn't connect to any meaning, because it wasn't in my experienced vocabulary of emergency signals. It took me approximately 4 seconds to remember what violet meant. I had read about it once, in a training document. The kind of training document that gets attached to the tail end of a larger manual, and that most people skim because it describes scenarios that are considered so unlikely they barely warrant serious attention. Violet means an unregistered sovereignty vessel has entered the perimeter. Violet means the sovereignty is here, and they did not file an approach notice because they were never planning to dock. I stood up from my chair, so fast I knocked the chair sideways. Around me, the 3 other people in the infrastructure office were just starting to look up from their work, confused by the color of the lights, not yet placing what they meant. I was halfway to the door when the first impact shook the floor. It wasn't like an explosion in the way you might imagine an explosion. There was no single sharp sound. It was more like the entire station took a breath and then decided, for just a moment, not to breathe back out. A deep, resonant compression that I felt in my chest more than I heard with my ears, followed by a low harmonic tone that the walls themselves seemed to be producing. Then the secondary systems kicked in, and every light in the corridor went red. I have been in conflict zones before, I told you that. But I want to be precise about something. Being in a conflict zone as an observer, arriving after the immediate violence has passed, is a categorically different experience from being inside a structure when the violence begins. The 34 conflict zones I documented were all retrospective work. I was always the person who came in afterward, stepping carefully, noting the damage, recording the geography of what had already happened. I had never been the person who didn't know yet whether they were going to be part of the geography someone else documented later. That distinction hit me very suddenly in the hallway outside the infrastructure office, standing in red light, with the floor still vibrating beneath my feet, and the sound of the station's internal alarm system cycling up through its full emergency sequence. I didn't know what to do. That's the honest truth. I am trained to observe. I'm not trained to act. And in that moment, standing in a corridor that was rapidly filling with the sound of thousands of beings in various states of panic beginning to move in every direction at once, I had absolutely no useful information in my body about what to do with myself. That's when I heard her voice. "Hey, observer, you with the recording unit." It came from my left, sharp. Not loud exactly, but with a quality that cut through the ambient noise the way a knife cuts through water, cleanly, without disturbing more than it needs to. Sergeant Varros was moving toward me at a pace that I would describe as controlled urgency. Not running, not walking, something between them that communicated both the seriousness of the situation and a refusal to contribute to the surrounding chaos. She was already in full tactical configuration, some kind of light armor that I recognized as human standard military equipment, a helmet that she was holding in one hand, and a weapon I did not recognize slung across her back. She reached me in about 4 strides. "Your Vale Row Xanthi, Confederacy Observer, Level 14 Infrastructure Audit." I confirmed this. I remember being surprised that she knew my name. "Good, I need you to stay with me. You know this level's layout." I told her I'd reviewed the schematics that morning. Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, more like the involuntary acknowledgement that an unexpectedly useful thing has happened. "Perfect," she said. "Helmet on, stay behind me. Don't stop moving no matter what you hear." I didn't have a helmet, I told her this. She looked at me for exactly 1 second, the kind of look that contains an entire assessment, and then pulled a secondary piece of equipment from a pouch on her hip and handed it to me. Some kind of emergency head covering that I couldn't identify but which, when she helped me fit it on, immediately began filtering the environmental noise to a manageable level and projecting a faint orange overlay on my field of vision. "It's set to flag movement in your peripheral," she said. "If it flashes, you tell me immediately." And then she started moving, and I followed her, and that was the beginning of the worst and most extraordinary experience of my life. The corridor's emergency protocols, under normal activation, would have sealed the transit tunnels and directed all beings in the structure toward designated shelter points on the outer levels. The idea is that the outer levels are the most structurally reinforced, built specifically to function as temporary safe zones, while the docking systems and the core are protected. None of that happened the way it was supposed to. What I learned later, pieced together from reports and debriefs, and the agonizingly slow process of reconstructing event timelines after the fact, was that the sovereignty vessels that entered the Ver corridor perimeter didn't open fire immediately. That would have been too direct, too simple. What they did first was send in a pulse, a targeted electromagnetic disruption designed specifically to interact with the corridor's central control architecture in a way that didn't destroy it, but confused it. The systems went haywire. Emergency seals activated on wrong sections. Tram cars froze in transit tunnels. The shelter point indicators started pointing in contradictory directions. And critically, the internal communication network, which should have been broadcasting evacuation instructions and calm, authoritative guidance, began producing fragmented signals that mixed legitimate emergency information with what I can only describe as deliberate noise. Panic, engineered, and delivered as infrastructure. The sovereignty had done this before. I knew that from historical documents, but knowing something in theory and experiencing the actual outcome of it are two entirely different things. The Level 14 main corridor, which had been a busy but orderly transit space 40 minutes earlier, was now a dense, unpredictable flow of frightened beings moving in approximately 6 different directions simultaneously. Malari, Seth, Pelinari, humans, species I couldn't immediately identify, all of them operating on their own survival instincts, which, as it turns out, are quite different depending on where you're from. Some species freeze when threatened, some bolt. Some make sounds that trigger alarm responses in other species, which creates cascading panic. The corridor was a compressed sample of all of this happening at once. Sergeant Varros moved through it the way water moves through a complex pipe system, finding the path of least resistance, not because she was avoiding the difficulty, but because she was calculating constantly where movement was possible and where it wasn't. I watched her redirect a Seth family unit that was pushing against the main flow into a side passage that I recognized from the schematics as leading to a maintenance junction with its own sealed access points. 45 seconds, maximum, to intercept them. Communicate in gestural language since she didn't have their vocal translator calibrated, and point them in the right direction. She never stopped assessing while she did it. Her eyes never stopped moving. I have studied efficient movement in high-stress environments as part of my observer training. I know what experienced personnel look like when they're performing well under pressure. I had never seen anything like this. We moved through 3 corridors before we encountered the first direct problem. The transit tunnel connecting Section 14C to the core access points had partially sealed. One of the emergency doors had come down about 2/3 of the way and then stopped, jammed either by the disruption pulse or by some physical obstruction I couldn't see. A group of about 20 beings were crowded in front of it, some trying to force it up, most just standing there, uncertain, the collective indecision producing a kind of frozen energy that made the space feel both crowded and still. Sergeant Varros took one look at the door and said a word in her own language that I recognized, from context, as an expression of frustration. Then she made a sound loud, clear, and carrying in a way that cut through the ambient noise, that drew the attention of everyone near the door. She said something in Confederacy standard, gesturing toward the side wall, and then crouched down and examined the bottom rail of the door. I moved up beside her. "What can I do?" She glanced at me sideways. "Know anything about hydraulic emergency mechanisms?" I did not. "Then find me something that fits in this gap," she said, indicating the space between the door's lower edge and the floor. Flat, dense, and at least 40 centimeters. I looked around. I noticed that the group near the door had shifted, some of them watching Sergeant Varros with that peculiar attention that people give to someone who seems to know what they're doing in a crisis. Others had started doing what she gestured toward, creating a small amount of additional space that made the area workable. A Pellinori male, broad, short, probably a transit worker based on his uniform, was holding what looked like a cargo restraint plate. Flat, dense, about 50 centimeters. I pointed at it and communicated my need in his language. He handed it over without hesitation. Varros looked at it when I gave it to her, looked at me, looked at the Pellinori. "Good," she said simply, and wedged the plate into the gap, braced herself against the door frame and pushed upward with everything she had. The door didn't move. She adjusted her grip, pushed again. The tendons in her arms were visible even through the armor. Her face went through a sequence of expressions: effort, frustration, recalibration, and then she made a sound and said, without looking at me, "I need someone larger, or more of everyone." I relayed this. The Pellinori male stepped up beside her without being asked. Then another human, a civilian I hadn't noticed, heavyset, wearing transit worker overalls, appeared from somewhere in the crowd and braced against the door on the other side. The 3 of them pushed. The door moved. Slowly at first, grinding against whatever was obstructing it, and then, with a sound like something giving way under sustained argument, it lurched upward and held, propped open enough for people to move through single file. Varros stepped back, pointed at the gap, and every single person in that corridor moved through it in an orderly sequence that she generated by the simple act of having done something useful and being clearly visible while she did it. Leadership, I thought, watching her. Not rank, not authority, something older than both. We were on the other side, moving through the transit tunnel toward the core access level, when the second impact hit. This one was different from the first. The first impact had been the pulse, felt but not heard in the traditional sense, a pressure event. This second one was structural. Something had hit the outer shell of the corridor, not the shields, the actual shell. I could hear it in the way the tunnel walls responded, a deep resonant crack that traveled through the composite alloy and arrived at my feet as vibration before it arrived at my ears as sound. Sergeant Varros stopped walking. For approximately 2 seconds, she was completely still. This was the first moment I understood, viscerally rather than intellectually, that she was afraid. Not panicked, not frozen. But the stillness she produced in those 2 seconds was not the stillness of assessment. It was the stillness of someone who has just received information that updates their understanding of the situation in a way they were hoping not to. Then she turned to me and said, very quietly, "That was an impact on the outer ring, level 14 to 16 section." I processed this. How many people are in that section? She didn't answer right away. How many? I asked again. 40, 50,000, she said, minimum. The number sat in the air between us. We need to get to the core access point, she said, and started moving again. The array is the only thing keeping the atmospheric systems running across those levels. If it goes down. She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. What I want to try to describe, and I want to be careful here because I don't think I have the right vocabulary for this, even in my own language, is the texture of moving through the Ver corridor in the hours that followed. It wasn't continuous. That's the thing no one tells you about crisis situations. There are moments of terrible clarity separated by moments of absolute confusion. We moved, and then something blocked us, and then we found another path. We encountered people who needed guidance, and Varros redirected them and kept moving. We heard sounds that I couldn't identify and that Varros identified immediately, weapons fire on an upper level, then distant, then closer. We passed through sections of the corridor that were perfectly intact, lights on, systems running, so ordinary looking that my brain kept trying to tell me I'd imagined the emergency. And then we turn a corner and find a section that was clearly compromised, emergency lighting only. One of the walls showing the dark smear of a pressure failure, the air slightly different in a way that made my lungs tighten. Through all of it, Varros moved. I've tried to count afterward how many individual decisions I watched her make in those hours. I've lost count somewhere in the hundreds. She was assessing, constantly. Not just the physical environment, the structural damage, the viable paths, the atmospheric indicators, but the people. Every person we encountered was a variable she was computing. Who could move quickly? Who was injured? Who was disoriented? Who had useful knowledge of the station's systems? Who was about to make a decision that would make things worse? She was never wrong about any of them. That's the thing that started to unsettle me about 4 hours into it. The consistency of her accuracy. Every judgment she made turned out to be correct. Not approximately correct, correct. The passage she said was clear. The being she assessed as injured turned out to have a fracture in their primary support joint that she'd identified from 30 meters away. The direction she chose when the path split every single time turned out to be the better option. At some point, I asked her how she was doing this. She gave me a look that I think, in human communication, conveys something like amusement mixed with something more complicated. Experience, she said. How much experience? A pause. 14 years of this kind of work, plus, she hesitated. We have good spatial memory. Humans. It's not something we think about much, but it's there. I've been building a map of this station since I arrived 3 days ago. Level layouts, flow patterns, structural irregularities. It's automatic. You memorized this station in 3 days. Not memorized, she said carefully. Felt it, there's a difference. I didn't understand the distinction then. I think I understand it now. We reached the core access corridor at 17:24 hours. I know this because my recording unit was still running, and the timestamp is there. 3 hours and 47 minutes after the initial alert. My legs were telling me it had been considerably longer. The core access corridor is a dedicated transit channel, wide, high-ceilinged, built to accommodate heavy equipment movement. Under normal circumstances, it's one of the more utilitarian sections of the corridor, industrial in a way that contrasts sharply with the more polished public-facing levels. The lighting has a bluish quality from the power conduits running along the walls, and there's a constant low hum from the machinery that you stop noticing after about 30 seconds, but that sits in the background of everything. When we arrived, the corridor was not empty. There were 6 of them. 6 sovereignty soldiers in full tactical deployment configuration. I knew what they were before Varro said anything. The sovereignty's military design aesthetic is distinctive in a way that always makes me think of deliberate intimidation. Their armor is designed to be visually overwhelming, angular, dark, larger than the body inside it. They move in formations that emphasize their collective mass rather than individual capability. They were positioned across the corridor in 2 groups of 3, and they had 4 Confederacy station workers kneeling in front of them. The station workers looked like they'd been there for a while. Their hands were bound behind them with restraints I recognized as sovereignty standard capture equipment. The lead sovereignty soldier, I identified them by their position and by the command indicators on their armor, was doing something to the access panel for the core, not destroying it, working it, which told me immediately that they weren't here to shut the core down, which would have been straightforward. They were here to take control of it. Control of the core meant control of the atmospheric systems, the shields, the emergency infrastructure, everything. Varro's had gone completely still beside me, and I had stopped when she stopped, and we were back in the shadows of a maintenance alcove about 40 meters from the nearest sovereignty soldier, and I became acutely, specifically, absolutely aware that I was not trained for what was about to happen, and that I was going to have to be inside it anyway. She looked at me. I looked at her. Options, she said quietly. It took me a moment to realize she was asking me, not thinking aloud. What? You know the layout. I've been building a map, but you've had the schematics. Are there other access points to the core control panel? I thought, my mind is trained for detail retrieval. It's the core of observer work, and so I went through what I'd reviewed that morning. The schematics. The junction points, the auxiliary systems. There's a secondary access point, I said. It's not on the main schematics. It was part of an older infrastructure system, pre-renovation. It's in the maintenance walkway above this corridor. The walkway connects to a manual override terminal that links to the core control architecture. She looked up, then at me. Can you get up there? Maybe, if there's a service access panel in this alcove. She checked there was. Then here's what we're going to do, she said, and she told me the plan in exactly the time it took to say it, which was about 45 seconds, and then she looked at me and said, "Can you do this?" And I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I was terrified. I was genuinely, specifically, deeply terrified in a way that I had not been in 3.5 hours of moving through a crisis situation. Because in those 3.5 hours, I had been following. I had been the person moving behind someone who knew what to do, and that had provided a kind of structural safety even within the physical danger. Following someone who is certain is its own form of shelter. And now she was asking me to act, independently, with a clear function in a plan that would succeed or fail partly based on whether I could do what I just said I could do. I said yes. She nodded once, checked her weapon, and then she was gone, moving along the edge of the alcove toward the far wall with a silence that still seems impossible to me when I think about it. For a being her size, she should not have been able to move that quietly. But she did, and she disappeared into the blue-tinted shadows of the corridor, and I was alone. I found the service panel. I got into the maintenance walkway. I will not pretend that any of this was graceful. I'm not a physically capable being in the way that someone with military training is physically capable. I scraped my arm on the panel casing. I moved through the walkway at what I imagine was a frustratingly slow pace for anyone watching. I had to stop twice to get my bearings against the mental map I'd constructed from the schematics. But I got there. The override terminal was exactly where I'd remembered it from the plans, an older piece of hardware, clearly from a previous era of the station's infrastructure, the kind of thing that gets left in place because removing it requires more effort than it's worth. It was live. The connection to the core control architecture was intact. I had maybe 90 seconds before I was supposed to activate it. I counted. Below me, through the walkway grating, I could see the corridor. And that's where I witnessed it. What she did. I have to be careful here about how I describe this, because I want to be accurate, and I am working from memory of something that I was watching from above, through a metal grating, in blue-tinted emergency lighting, while also counting down from 90. Sergeant Varro walked out of the shadows of the far side of the corridor. Not ran, walked. She positioned herself at roughly 30 meters from the nearest sovereignty soldier and said something in their language, I realized later, or close enough to it to function, and the effect was immediate and total. All 6 soldiers turned toward her. She had their complete attention. And then she started talking. I could hear the sounds, but I couldn't process the content clearly from above. What I could process was the quality of what she was doing, because it wasn't what I expected. I expected some kind of aggressive posture, weapon raised, challenge issued, the kind of confrontation that forces immediate response. Instead, she was conversing, calmly with authority, in a register that clearly communicated that she considered herself a peer to these armed soldiers, and not in any way disadvantaged by the situation she was standing in. The lead sovereignty soldier had stopped working on the access panel. The other 5 had not advanced. Something about the specific frequency of her voice, or the content of what she was saying, or the combination of her physical stillness and her evident lack of alarm, had produced in them the same thing I'd seen her produce in panicked civilians earlier, a pause. A moment of recalibration. A hesitation that, in a tactical situation, is as good as a window. I hit 90 seconds. I activated the override terminal. The effect was not subtle. The core control architecture, rerouted through the auxiliary system, triggered a cascade of reconnections across the station's emergency infrastructure. The lights in the corridor went from blue emergency to full operational white in an instant. The atmospheric alerts that had been cycling silently in the wall panels activated into audible broadcast. And most critically, the emergency seals that had been wrongly positioned by the sovereignty's pulse assault began to reset, level by level, toward their correct configurations. The station, in effect, woke up. The sound it made waking up was considerable. The sovereignty soldiers reacted. Of course they did. In the sudden sensory reconfiguration of the corridor, the lights, the sound, the shift in the station's operational state, they moved, which is what trained soldiers do when the environment changes. 3 of them toward the core access panel, 2 toward Varro's, 1 briefly toward the ceiling I realized the sound of me in the maintenance walkway. I did not wait to see what the one looking at the ceiling would do next. I moved. Below me in the corridor, I heard Varro's voice, louder now, a different register entirely, the calm conversational tone gone, and replaced by something that I can only describe as a sound that belongs to a different set of human communication than I'd encountered before. Not a shout. Something more directional than a shout. A command. Absolute and without apology. And then the sounds of the corridor changed significantly, and I moved faster through the maintenance walkway, and I stopped looking down. Document 2, Secondary Account. Filed by CMDR, Pilith Oros Confederacy Emergency Response Verk Station. Date of account, 3 days post-event. Purpose, supplementary record to the primary witness account of Vale Row Xanthi. I wasn't in the corridor when it happened. I want to be clear about that. What I'm providing here is a reconstruction from multiple accounts, the station's partially recovered sensor logs, and 2 brief conversations with Sergeant Varros in the immediate aftermath. The 6 sovereignty soldiers in the core access corridor were, as far as we can reconstruct, a specialized insertion team. Their specific assignment was to secure control of the core array and use it to disable the atmospheric systems on the outer levels, levels 14 through 17, which were where the highest concentrations of civilians had been directed by the compromised emergency protocols. It was not a military target. It was a civilian infrastructure target. The sovereignty's strategy in the Verk corridor was not direct military engagement. It was leverage. Gain control of life support for 50,000 beings. Use that as a negotiating instrument. Extract what you want from the Confederacy response team before they can mount an adequate counter. Sergeant Varros understood this before she'd been told. She told me afterward in those brief conversations that the moment she identified the sovereignty soldiers' position in a service corridor, not at a military installation, she knew they weren't there to fight. They were there to operate. And beings who are there to operate rather than to fight have different threat responses. You can interrupt their operation more effectively than you can defeat them militarily, if you understand what they're operating toward. She walked into that corridor and talked to them because she had calculated, and she was right, that a direct confrontation would push them into military mode, would cause them to activate whatever contingency protocols they had for defensive situations, which likely included destroying the core access panel they'd been working on rather than allowing it to be retaken. But a non-threatening engagement, a conversation, delivered with authority and without apparent alarm, would preserve their operational focus. They would stay in operational mode rather than defensive mode. They would keep trying to work the problem they'd been assigned rather than responding to the new problem she represented. It bought approximately 90 seconds, which was exactly what Vale Row needed. When the core systems were rerouted and the station's infrastructure began to reset, the situation in the corridor became something that I will describe carefully. Sergeant Varros was not uninjured. I want to be honest about that too. One of the 5 soldiers who had been positioned at flanking angles did, in the confusion of the reset cascade, discharge a weapon. The discharge struck the wall beside her rather than her directly, but the resulting pressure event was significant enough to require medical attention and produced a temporary sensory disruption that she described to me as a very unpleasant sound that got inside my head and stayed there for about an hour. She continued operating for the next 40 minutes before she accepted medical assistance. The 6 sovereignty soldiers in the corridor did not complete their objective. The station's emergency infrastructure, once restored, allowed Confederacy response teams to enter the corridor's systems properly and begin countering the broader sovereignty assault. The outer level's atmospheric systems were never compromised. The 50,000 civilians in levels 14 through 17 were evacuated through properly functioning emergency protocols within 6 hours of the initial attack. Verk corridor suffered significant damage to the outer shell, 2 of the 5 docking rings, and the transit infrastructure on upper levels. Casualties from the initial assault and the following hours of crisis numbered in the hundreds, a terrible number, and I do not want to minimize it. But against the projected outcome of the sovereignty's actual strategic objective, the number is a small fraction of what it could have been. The difference was made by a human sergeant and a Confederacy observer who happened to know the station's schematics and happened to be in the right corridor at the right time. Or perhaps not happened to be. Perhaps that's not the right framing. End of Part 1. Part 2. What terror actually looks like. Document 3. Continuation of primary witness account. Filed by Valerow Xanthi, 3rd grade observer, Confederacy of Aligned Worlds. Date of entry, 7 days post-event. Note, this section was composed with more time for reflection. Some details may be interpreted differently than in Document 1, which was filed within 48 hours. I spent 4 days in the medical section of the Confederacy emergency installation that had been set up in the outer docking areas following the sovereignty attack. Not because I was significantly injured. I had some bruising from the maintenance walkway, a respiratory irritation from a section of the corridor where the atmospheric system had been running slightly wrong for too long before the reset, and what the medical staff described, with professional gentleness, as acute situational shock, which I think is their way of saying that my body had finally caught up with what my mind had been processing for 8 hours and had decided that the appropriate response was to stop cooperating for a while. I slept mostly, ate when prompted, was assessed by 3 different personnel at various points, and in the spaces between all of that, I thought about what I'd seen. Not the attack itself. I'd filed the preliminary account of that within 48 hours, in a state of clinical focus that I now understand was itself a protective mechanism, giving myself a task, a structure, a familiar professional function to inhabit while my system worked through the more complex processing. What I thought about in those 4 days was Sergeant Varros and the other humans. Because it wasn't just her. That's the thing I hadn't fully processed in the immediate aftermath. I'd been so close to Varros, so focused on moving with her through those hours, that I'd been experiencing the event at ground level. It was only later, when the full event reconstruction began, and I started receiving reports from other observers and responders who'd been elsewhere in the station, that I began to understand the scope of what the human personnel at Ver Corridor had done. All 4 of them. The tall one I'd noticed near the corridor junction on my first day, Specialist Marcus Fell, had spent the crisis hours doing something that I still struggled to explain the logic of when I tried to reconstruct it from available accounts. He had been systematically moving through level 14 and the adjacent levels, not evacuating, not retreating to a defensive position, but locating the clusters of disoriented beings who had been caught by the compromised emergency protocols and were being directed by malfunctioning systems towards sections of the station that had become structurally compromised. He had no communication link. The internal network was too degraded to be reliable. He had no updated structural information. What he had was, apparently, his own spatial assessment of the station, that same memorization through feeling that Varros had described, and whatever he could directly observe about which sections of the corridor were showing signs of structural stress. He moved people for hours, group by group, corridor by corridor. He spoke several of the transit hub's most common languages, which I later learned was not an accident. Human security personnel assigned to high-traffic locations are routinely briefed to develop functional communication in the species most commonly present. He used this fluency to give directions that beings could actually act on, rather than the fragmented, unreliable broadcast instructions that the compromised system was still producing. The accounts from the civilians he redirected describe him as calm. Consistently, across multiple different species testimony, the word used, or the closest equivalent in each language, translates to some variation of calm. One Malari elder I spoke to later said something that I've been thinking about ever since. He was afraid, she said. I could see it in the way he held his body. Not his face he was keeping very controlled. But there was something in the way he was carrying himself, like he was holding something heavy. He was afraid, and he was afraid on our behalf, and he was doing it anyway, and I think that is the most reassuring thing I have ever seen a being do. I asked Varos about this eventually. Not about Fel specifically, but about the fear. I found her on the 5th day in a quiet section of the installation, doing something I wasn't expecting, sitting with what looked like a small, flexible pad, drawing on it. Not a tactical diagram. Something abstract. Shapes. She didn't seem surprised to see me. I sat down near her and said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. She put down the drawing pad and looked at me with that direct quality that I'd noticed from the beginning. Go ahead, she said. Were you scared? I asked. In the corridor the whole time we were moving, were you scared? A pause. Not the pause of someone deciding whether to lie, I thought. The pause of someone deciding how to be precisely truthful about something complicated. Yes, she said. The whole time. The whole time. But you, I stopped, tried to find the right way to ask it. You didn't show it, you functioned, you made decisions, you were. Accurate, she said, supplying the word I'd been reaching for. Accurate, I agreed. How? She was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something back? She said. I told her yes. When you were in the maintenance walkway, counting down, waiting to hit the override terminal, were you scared? I thought about it, terrified, I said. And did you do it? Oh, yes. There's your answer, she said. I sat with that for a moment. That's not a very satisfying answer. Something moved across her face, something warm and a little tired. No, she agreed. It's not. The longer version is that we practice it, humans, from very early. We put ourselves in situations that are frightening and we practice moving through them anyway. Not to stop feeling afraid. I don't think anyone ever stops feeling afraid when there's actually something to be afraid of. But to build up a kind of, she paused, searching. Callous. Except it's not a callous because a callous stops you from feeling things, and that's not what this is. It's more like a familiarity. You feel the fear and you know it and you recognize it and it's not a surprise anymore. And because it's not a surprise, it doesn't have the same power to stop you. I thought about this. That sounds exhausting, I said. She looked at me for a second and then she laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind of sound that isn't performed for an audience but happens regardless. It changed her face significantly. Yeah, she said, it is, it really is. On the 6th day, I was well enough to move around the installation without medical supervision, and I went looking for the full picture. I spoke to as many people as I could find who had direct experience of the crisis. Civilians, station workers, other Confederacy personnel who had been deployed in the response. I used my observer training, which is useful in these situations. People respond to someone who is clearly there to listen and record rather than to judge or to extract information for tactical use. The picture that assembled itself was, and I want to choose the right word here, overwhelming. Not in a negative sense, exactly. Overwhelming in the way that very large things are overwhelming. The kind of thing where you're standing in front of it and you keep trying to take it in and you keep running out of the right-sized container for it. The 4 human security personnel attached to the diplomatic envoy had functioned, across the 8 hours of the sovereignty attack, as something that I don't have a single precise term for. They weren't a command structure. None of them held authority over the other beings in the station, and they never attempted to establish that kind of authority. They weren't even, in the strict sense, coordinating with each other. The degraded communication network meant they were operating largely independently, with incomplete information about what the others were doing. What they were, individually and without coordination, was useful. In the specific, targeted, high-precision way that something is useful when it is exactly matched to what the situation requires. Fell moved people who were in danger. Varos secured the infrastructure that kept everyone alive. A third human, Corporal Yemiades, spent the crisis hours at the medical point that had been established near the central atrium, providing emergency care alongside station medical personnel with training that, as I later discovered, significantly exceeded what her rank and designation would have suggested. She had spent her off-duty hours for the past 3 years, apparently, acquiring supplemental medical certifications because, and she said this very matter-of-factly when I spoke to her, you never know when you're going to be the most qualified person in the room. The fourth human, I'll come back to him separately. The fourth human was named Private First Class Danilo Osai. He was 22 years old, the youngest of the four, the one I'd seen least of during the crisis itself because his assigned post had been the upper access levels, far from where Varos and I had been moving. I found him on the 7th day, sitting in a supply area near the secondary docking bay, writing something by hand in a physical notebook. This surprised me. I don't often encounter beings who still use physical writing implements. I asked him about it and he shrugged in that particular human way and said his grandmother had given him the habit and he hadn't been able to shake it. He was the one who had gone into the compromised sections. This is the part I have the hardest time writing. The outer shell impact, the second impact, the one that had struck levels 14 to 16, had created a section of the corridor that was not destroyed but was severely compromised. Partial atmospheric failure, structural instability in the floors. The kind of environment that every emergency protocol in existence tells you not to enter without full equipment and backup and a clear extraction plan. He had gone in with a hand torch, a partial emergency kit, and the station map on his comm unit, which had been functioning intermittently at best. He had been in there for 4.5 hours. The people he found were ones who had been trapped when the emergency seals activated, caught between a locked door on one side and a compromised passage on the other. Some of them had been injured by the impact. Some had been in the section so long they were experiencing atmospheric effects. He'd gotten 23 of them out. One at a time in some cases, multiple trips through the same compromised passage, with a hand torch and a partial emergency kit and a comm unit that wasn't working right. I asked him how he'd known to go in, whether someone had given him the directive, or whether he'd identified it from a distance, or whether. I heard someone, he said simply. Through the sealed section. The walls carry sound pretty well in there. You could hear if you were paying attention. And you went in. He looked at me. He had a very direct gaze, not calculating, like Varos's, but present in a specific way. Like he was actually seeing me, rather than assessing me. There were people in there, he said, and then, after a moment, as if he thought the first sentence might need clarification, I was right there. I wrote that down, exactly as he said it, and I've read it back to myself probably 30 times since. There were people in there, I was right there. As if no further logic was required. As if the chain of causation from those two facts to the action he took was so short as to be barely worth noting. Let me try to describe the thing I've been building toward. I told you at the beginning that I'd told this story 3 times before filing this account, and that each time, people had said things about bravery and survival, and that each time, I'd stopped myself from correcting them. What I've been trying to work out, in the 7 days since the Ver corridor, is exactly what I would say if I didn't stop myself, if I actually corrected the record. Here is my best attempt. Bravery is a word we use when we're watching from the outside. When we see someone do something that we calculate from our external position carries a high risk. We see the risk, We see the action taken despite the risk, and we call it bravery because that's the word in our vocabulary for the gap between those two things. But I don't think that's what I watched the humans do in the Ver corridor. Because watching from the inside, or as close to the inside as an observer can get, the gap looks different. It's not that they didn't see the risk. They saw it more clearly than anyone else in the station. Their spatial memory, their training, their experience, all of it meant they had more precise information about exactly how dangerous the situation was than almost any other being present. But the risk wasn't for them the primary calculation. The primary calculation was different. It was something more like, here is the situation, here is what needs to happen, here is whether I am positioned to make that happen, proceed accordingly. The risk was a variable in the calculation, an important one, but not the determining factor. What was the determining factor? I've been sitting with this question for a week, and I think my best answer is this: function. What function is available to me in this situation? What does this situation require that I can provide? Varos knew the station's layout and she knew crisis management. The crisis required someone who could navigate the station's compromised geography and manage civilian movement. She was available. She proceeded accordingly. Fel knew languages and he had spatial memory, and he had the ability to stay calm while being visibly present for frightened people. The crisis required exactly that. He proceeded accordingly. Adiz knew emergency medicine. The crisis required emergency medicine. She proceeded accordingly. I heard people behind a wall. He was standing right there. He proceeded accordingly. None of them required the risk to be acceptable before they acted. They required the function to be necessary and themselves to be the available instrument. That was sufficient. And I realized, sitting in the medical bay on the 5th day, that this is what terrified me. Not the attack, not the sovereignty soldiers, not the compromised infrastructure or the failing atmospheric systems or the damaged outer shell or any of the specific physical dangers of those 8 hours. What terrified me was understanding, for the first time in 11 years of observing conflict zones and war, and the full range of what beings do to each other and to themselves, what human beings actually are. Not soldiers exactly. Soldiers are a category, a defined role with defined parameters. You know what a soldier is, and what they're for, and what they're likely to do in a given situation. Soldiers are predictable in the specific way that anything which has been designed and trained for a purpose is predictable. Humans are something different. Humans are beings who have apparently decided, somewhere in their evolutionary or cultural development, I genuinely don't know which, that the appropriate response to a situation requiring a function is simply to provide the function, regardless of whether they are officially designated as the provider of that function, regardless of whether the risk calculation comes out in their favor, regardless of whether anyone has authorized them to proceed. They just proceed. And this is terrifying in the most specific way possible, which is, it makes them completely unpredictable. Because you cannot model them. When the sovereignty launched their attack on the Ver corridor, they had models. They had projections. They had calculated what the being population of the station would do under the conditions they were creating. They knew how Malari respond to emergency situations. They knew how Seth behave under atmospheric threat. They knew how Pelennori communities organize when infrastructure fails. What they did not know, what I'm not sure anyone fully knows, including other humans, is what a human being will do when they hear someone behind a wall. I spoke to Varos one more time before she was redeployed. It was a short conversation, partly because we were both tired and partly because I think we had reached the point where the things we needed to say to each other were getting harder to say in ways that didn't require more energy than either of us had. She asked me if I was going back to observer work. I told her I wasn't sure. She nodded, didn't push. I asked her, this was the thing I'd been wanting to ask for days, if she ever thought about what it would be like to not do this. Not the security work specifically. The whole posture, the constant readiness, the spatial mapping and the fear under control and the function over risk calculation. All of it. Sure, she said, sometimes. And she thought for a moment. My grandmother, she said, used to tell me this thing. She'd say, and this is a translation, it sounds better in the original language, she'd say, the fire doesn't care if you're afraid of it. The fire just burns. So you might as well know how to carry water.